All right, welcome back. So today we're going to tackle a huge question, one that honestly baffled economists for decades. How in the world do you predict the future of the economy? We're going to look at this massive shift in thinking. We're talking about going from driving a car by only looking in the rearview mirror to actually looking through the windshield. And you'll see why this one change, this one idea, has some pretty profound consequences for, well, all of us.
So here's the central problem, right? The thing that kept economists up at night for years. So much of what actually drives an economy, I'm talking about what you decide to buy, what businesses choose to invest in, it all hangs on what we think is going to happen next. You know, what we expect for inflation or for our own income. But here's the catch. Those expectations, they're totally invisible. You can't just, look them up in a spreadsheet. So the big question becomes, how on earth do you build a model of the economy when you're missing its most critical ingredient?
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll dig into this whole expectation problem and the first big idea for how to solve it, basically learning from our past mistakes. Then, we'll get to the real game changer, this idea that kicked off a full-blown rational revolution. After that, we're going to put this new theory to the test and ask, can policy actually be beaten? And we'll wrap up by looking at the really wild conclusion that comes out of all this, the incredible power of a good surprise.
So let's really dive into that first part, the fundamental challenge. Early macroeconomists, they knew that what people believed about the future was basically the engine of the entire economy. But, and this is a big but, those beliefs were completely invisible. It was like their models had this massive blind spot. And they were desperate for a way to take this unobservable stuff, what's inside our heads, and somehow make it observable, something they could actually work with.
And the first big breakthrough was an idea called the adaptive expectations hypothesis. Honestly, it's a super intuitive, really common sense approach. It basically just says that we figure out what's going to happen next by looking at what just happened and, correcting for how wrong we were last time. I think the best way to picture this is to imagine you're driving a car, but you're only allowed to look in the rearview mirror. That's it. You see that you just drifted a little to the left, so what do? You correct by steering a bit to the right. You're always adapting, always adjusting your course based on where you've just been, not on that big curve you can clearly see coming up ahead through the windshield. Naturally, economists captured this whole idea in a formula. Now, don't get hung up on the symbols here. It's the logic that's really important. All this equation is really saying is that you update your forecast for this period based on just a fraction of how wrong you were last period. So let's say inflation was way higher than you predicted last month. Well, you'll adjust your prediction for next month upwards, but you'll probably do it kind of cautiously. You adapt.
And this seems pretty reasonable, doesn't it? We all learn from our mistakes, right? But there's a hidden and really critical weakness in this whole model. What happens when the world isn't just bouncing around randomly, but is actually following a clear, predictable trend? What happens if you just keep making the exact same kind of mistake over and over and over again?
And this is the fatal flaw. Think about it. If inflation is climbing steadily month after month, this adaptive model means you will always be one step behind. You'll constantly be underestimating what's really happening. You're not just wrong, you're systematically wrong. The model basically assumes that people are just ignoring incredibly valuable information, like the obvious trend right in front of their faces, or maybe a big government announcement about what they're planning to do next, stuff that could help them make a way better forecast. So that brings us right to our next section, a rational revolution. You see, these persistent, totally predictable mistakes from the old model, they basically paved the way for a complete revolution in economic thinking. An economist named John Muth came along and proposed a brand new idea. He basically said, hey, what if people aren't so naive? What if they're actually rational?
And this is the rational expectations hypothesis, and it is a really powerful idea. Now, it's not saying that people have a crystal ball or that their forecasts are always spot-on perfect. Nope. It just says that people use all the information they have available to them. We're talking past data, current events, their own understanding of how the economy works, any announcements about future policy, all of it, to make the best possible forecast they can. The key is, they don't keep making the same dumb mistakes over and over.
Okay, so when you put them side by side like this, you can really see what a massive shift in thinking this was. Adaptive expectations, totally backward looking, it's chained to whatever mistakes you made in the past. But rational expectations, that's all about being forward looking, using everything you've got. And the absolute core difference really comes down to the errors. With the adaptive model, you can be fooled again and again in the same way.
With the rational model, sure, you might still be wrong, but your mistakes are random. They're not predictable.
So, what does this new way of thinking actually look like? Well, it has some pretty powerful hallmarks. First, on average, you're right. Yep, you'll overshoot sometimes, undershoot other times, but over time, all those errors, the positive and the negative, they just cancel each other out. Second, your mistakes don't show any kind of pattern that someone could use to make a better forecast. And maybe most importantly, your forecast error, the part you get wrong, is just the truly random, unpredictable static in the system. You've literally made the most accurate forecast you possibly could with the information you had.
Which brings us to our next big question. Can policy be beaten? This is the ultimate test. And look, this is not just some dry academic debate. This theory has an absolutely shocking implication for government economic policy. I mean, if people really are rational, can policymakers even steer the economy anymore?
And this leads to one of the most controversial and honestly mind-bending ideas in all of modern macroeconomics. It's called the policy ineffectiveness proposition. And what it says is that any predictable policy action, anything the government or central bank does that we can see coming, should have absolutely no effect on the real economy. We're talking about things like output, employment, jobs. It'll only change prices. According to this, only surprises can actually move the needle.
I know, that sounds pretty extreme, right? So let's actually walk through exactly how this is supposed to work. We're going to pull out the classic tool from the Economist Toolkit, the good old aggregate supply and aggregate demand model.
Okay, so first, let's set the scene. Imagine the economy is just humming along, running smoothly right at its full employment level. Everything's in balance. Then, the government calls a big press conference. They get up on the podium and announce a clear, totally predictable plan. We are going to increase the money supply to boost the economy and create more jobs.
Now, under the old way of thinking, the adaptive expectations view, this is fantastic news. More money flowing into the system means more spending. On our graph, that shifts the aggregate demand curve out to the right, and look what happens. We get a temporary boom. Both prices and real output go up. It looks like the policy worked perfectly.
But, and here's the huge question that this whole revolution forces us to ask. What if people aren't so naive? What if they were watching that press conference on TV, they heard the plan, understood exactly what the government was doing, and used that information to form their own expectations about what was coming next? And here it is. This is the punchline of the entire rational expectation story. People aren't fooled. They hear the announcement, and they know that more money chasing the same amount of goods just means higher prices. So what do? Workers go to their bosses and demand higher wages to keep up. Firms start raising their prices, all in anticipation of the policy. And the result? On our graph, the aggregate supply curve shifts up at the very same time that the aggregate demand curve shifts right. The economy just moves straight up. We get higher prices for sure, but output? It's right back where it started. The predictable policy was completely neutralized before it even had a chance to get going.
This simple little equation here, it captures that entire powerful result. All it's really saying is that real output is only going to move away from its natural potential because of that little Greek letter at the very end. That's epsilon. That's the surprise, the random, unpredictable shock. But notice what's missing from this equation. The predictable part of the policy. It's just gone. It's completely absent because, in this model, it has zero effect on the real economy. Okay, so that brings us to our final section. We've gone on this whole journey, from rearview mirrors to crystal balls. So what's the big takeaway here? What does all of this really mean for us? All right, let's nail down the crucial takeaways. First, how we model expectations is not some minor academic detail. It fundamentally changes everything about our economic predictions. Assuming people just look backward, well, that implies they can be systematically fooled over and over. But if you assume they're rational and look forward, using all the info they have, it means any predictable policy just gets baked into everyone's expectations and completely loses its punch. It can't affect real things like jobs and growth. In this world, the only thing that actually moves the needle is a surprise.
And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought to chew on. If this theory is right, if predictable, systematic policies are ultimately toothless, does that mean the only real tool policymakers have left is the ability to surprise people? Does managing a modern economy now depend less on careful, transparent planning and more on the sheer element of shock? That's a question that economists and policymakers are still debating right up to this very day.